Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Have you ever found yourself staring at your phone, just watching those three little typing dots appear?
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
They just dance around for a few seconds and then they just vanish.
And the hours turn into days.
Exactly. Days bleed into weeks, and you are left sitting there with this terrible hollow pit in your stomach.
Because you've been completely ghosted.
You have. It's a universally painful, incredibly modern experience. And if you are listening to this right now, the odds are remarkably high that you've been on the receiving end of that deafening, confusing silence.
At least once in your life, yeah.
Right. But today, we are taking a completely different approach to this topic.
We really are.
We're not just going to sit here and complain about bad manners or the decay of modern dating etiquette or, how technology is ruining communication.
No, that's not what we're doing.
Our mission in this deep dive is to get into the structural psychology of exactly why being ghosted feels so uniquely physically destabilizing to the human brain.
And it is a physical feeling.
It really is. We want to help you understand the hidden mechanics of this experience so you can actively protect your self-worth when it happens. I'm your host, by the way, and I'm thrilled to jump into this.
And I'm the resident expert for today's deep dive. And it's a vital distinction to make right at the top. We are moving far beyond hurt feelings today.
We're talking about profound cognitive disruption.
Exactly. To explore this, we are pulling from the fascinating work of R.J. Starr, specifically drawing from his books The Psychology of Being Human and Gone Without Goodbye.
His research offers a completely novel way to view human connection.
And subtle disconnection.
Right. But before we plunge into the mechanics of that disruption, setting some context on the source material itself is really essential.
Definitely.
For everyone listening, it is crucial to understand that R.J. Starr is an independent psychology educator. He's a scholar and an author.
Right. He's not a licensed therapist.
Important caveat. He isn't a clinician offering individualized treatment or medical advice. You won't find him diagnosing patients or prescribing behavioral therapies.
Instead, his work is rooted in what he calls the psychological architecture framework.
Which is very different.
It is. He examines human behavior through a highly systems-oriented lens.
And that systems-oriented lens is exactly what makes his perspective so illuminating, I think.
I agree. The framework examines how our minds, our emotions, our sense of identity, and our internal structures for meaning all attempt to maintain coherence.
It asks how the human system functions under the weight of extreme complexity.
Or sudden, inexplicable disruptions, like, a person you care about simply vanishing into thin air.
Just poof, gone.
Right. He is looking at the structural foundations of our psychology rather than just our episodic emotional reactions to a bad Tuesday.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starr makes a really fascinating distinction right out of the gate, focusing on the fundamental difference between rejection and ghosting.
Because they are not the same thing.
Not at all. I mean, rejection hurts. Nobody enjoys being told they aren't a match.
Of course not.
But Starr points out that rejection actually has contour. It draws a distinct boundary.
It formally and officially reorganizes the relationship.
Yes. You might absolutely hate the explanation you are given, but the relationship has been transitioned.
You know where you stand.
Exactly. Ghosting, on the other hand, just removes the person without ever reorganizing the shared narrative between you two.
And to understand why that lack of reorganization is so devastating, we have to look at evolutionary psychology.
How human cognition actually functions.
Right. Our brains are, at their core, incredibly sophisticated prediction engines. Evolutionary survival depended heavily on our ability to predict tribal dynamics and social reciprocity.
Because missing a social cue millennia ago could mean exile.
Which meant death.
Right.
Because of that, human cognition is completely organized around continuity. When you interact with someone, your brain isn't just recording isolated, disconnected events.
It's constantly building unfolding sequences.
Yes. It generates expectations and creates a predictive model of what is supposed to happen next based on the established patterns of your interactions.
I think about it like reading a novel.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. Rejection is like reading a tremendously sad final chapter. You might cry, you might get angry and throw the book across the room.
But the story has concluded.
Exactly. The narrative arc is complete, and eventually you can put the book back on the shelf and move on.
But ghosting is different.
Ghosting is like getting to the absolute climax of the story, eagerly flipping the page, and finding that the rest of the book is just completely blank pages.
That is an excellent analogy. Because there is no terminal punctuation to that story, your brain's predictive system simply stays engaged.
It leaves the cognitive loop wide open.
Wide open. Your mind endlessly scans the environment, it replays your memories, and it searches obsessively for the missing information that will complete the narrative sequence.
It's trying to write the end of the chapter, but it doesn't have the ink.
I love that, yes.
I find that so incredibly validating for anyone listening. If you've ever been ghosted and felt like you were completely losing your mind because you couldn't stop obsessing over it,
That isn't you being fragile.
or overly attached.
Absolutely not. The confusion, the sleepless nights, the endless rumination that is not emotional excess, it is not a sign of weakness.
It's biology.
It's the completely natural biological and psychological consequence of a severe narrative interruption.
Wow.
Your central nervous system is doing exactly what it was biologically designed to do. It is trying to close an open loop without the necessary data to do so.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When we talk about ghosting in everyday conversation, we usually frame it as a massive moral failure.
Oh, constantly.
We call the person who ghosted a coward. We say they are immature. We label them as cruel or toxic.
We heavily moralize the action.
We do, but Starr's framework completely removes that moralizing lens. He argues that ghosting is not primarily a moral category at all.
Instead, he defines it as a regulatory maneuver.
A regulatory maneuver.
Yes. Changing that definition shifts the entire paradigm. Starr explains that ghosting is a form of withdrawal deployed specifically to regulate internal strain.
So if you think about the person doing the ghosting,
They are facing a relational complexity that has suddenly exceeded their psychological tolerance.
their internal system is sounding an alarm.
And they are using absence as a tool to turn down the volume of their own discomfort.
I imagine that complexity isn't always just a callous lack of interest, though.
No, not at all.
Sometimes it might be the exact opposite. Perhaps the intimacy is growing too fast, and that triggers a massive flight response.
Or maybe it's an emerging ambivalence they can't quite articulate.
Or deep-seated terror of confrontation.
That is entirely accurate. The specific nature of the complexity varies wildly from person to person. But the unifying factor is that explaining any of those feelings requires what Starr refers to as sustained presence.
Which is incredibly heavy lifting, emotionally speaking.
It is exhausting. To maintain sustained presence during a breakup or a separation, you have to do 3 very difficult things.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have to articulate internal feelings that might feel totally incoherent even to yourself. You might not fully know why you want to leave.
That's tough.
Second, you have to willingly occupy the role of the bad guy who is inflicting pain.
Nobody wants to be the villain.
Right. And third, most intensely, you have to sit there and tolerate the other person's emotional reaction in real time.
And by choosing silence, they get to bypass that entire gauntlet.
Exactly. The ghoster collapses all of those demands instantly. Their internal system quiets down.
They don't have to do the heavy lifting of articulation.
And they certainly don't have to watch you cry or get angry.
But the real tragedy is that the cost of their emotional regulation is that the relational ambiguity is entirely transferred outward onto you.
They protect their own peace by handing you utter chaos.
They do.
Furthermore, silence acts as a shield for the ghoster's self-concept. If they don't have the conversation, they don't have to look in the mirror and see themselves as hurtful or disappointing.
They get to maintain an internal identity of being non-disruptive.
Ironically, they feel they're keeping things peaceful by simply fading away, completely avoiding the unpredictability of a confrontation.
There's an asymmetry there that Starr highlights, which is just wild to think about. If they stay and explain, they become the active agent of your pain.
Yes.
If they disappear, they actually get to preserve their own internal memory of the relationship, frozen right at its last unchallenged, happy moment.
They avoid witnessing the deterioration.
They walk away with a pristine memory, and you inherit all the messy ambiguity.
What's fascinating here is how the ghosted mind processes that inherited ambiguity. This brings us to a foundational concept in Starr's work called proportional causality.
Proportional causality.
Human cognition demands that significant relational shifts must have equally significant explanations. Our brains insist that if something big happens, there must be a massive, undeniable reason for it.
Like, if an entire house suddenly collapses into rubble, your immediate assumption is that there was a massive sinkhole or a catastrophic foundation failure.
You don't assume the house fell down because a single nail was loose in the floorboards.
Right. So if a person completely vanishes from your life after months of connection, your brain insists there must be a catastrophic reason for it.
Precisely. The problem is you don't have the external data, the ghoster's explanation, to prove what that catastrophic reason is.
But wait, if the brain is just desperately looking for data to close the loop, why doesn't it just assume the ghoster got busy at work or lost their phone or had a family emergency?
That's a great question.
Why does it almost always immediately jump to deep personal shame?
Because the brain is a highly efficient machine, and it seeks coherence using the most readily available data set it has access to.
And what's that?
In the absence of the other person's thoughts, your own self is your largest, most immediate data set. The mind turns inward.
Oh, wow.
It assumes if the effect was this extreme, the cause must be equally extreme. And since I am the only variable I can examine, I must be the cause.
You become the immediate explanatory variable.
Yes. You conclude I must have done something incredibly wrong, or worse, I must be fundamentally unlovable.
Because shame grows in a vacuum. Anger requires a clear target and an articulated harm.
Exactly.
You can be angry at someone for breaking up with you because they give you the facts to be angry about. But without facts, you try to reconcile how great the connection felt with the undeniable reality that they've vanished.
And the only bridge your brain can build between those two conflicting realities is that you are somehow structurally deficient.
And we have to remember what we discussed regarding the ghoster's internal regulation.
Right. The person who left may have evaluated the connection and simply decided it wasn't the right fit for their life.
Which is a normal part of human interaction.
It is. But their silence entirely obscures the scale of that decision. In reality, it was a highly specific relational mismatch.
But without them communicating the scale, your isolated brain inflates that specific mismatch into a global, sweeping indictment of your entire worth as a human being.
Exactly.
Obviously, the psychological impact of that inflation scales depending on how deep the relationship was. It is one thing to be ghosted after a Tinder date, and another entirely to be ghosted by someone you loved.
Starr categorizes this varying impact into what he calls narrative density, breaking it down into 3 distinct levels.
The scale of disruption is entirely dependent on that narrative density.
Yes. The first level is early stage, or low-density relationships. You've been on a few dates, maybe had some great late-night text conversations.
When you get ghosted at this stage, the destabilization you feel is primarily about projection collapse.
Meaning you aren't really mourning a long, rich, shared history. You are mourning the imagined future your brain had already started building.
Your predictive system took a small amount of positive data and eagerly extrapolated it forward into a hypothetical future.
Yes. The silence disrupts that anticipated trajectory, causing acute disappointment, but it doesn't shake your core identity.
Then we move to the second level, mid-density relationships. These are actively developing connections.
Let's put a face to this to really understand it.
Okay.
Imagine a scenario with 2 people, Sarah and John. They've been dating for 3 or 4 months. They have inside jokes. They text good morning every day. John has met a few of Sarah's friends.
Reciprocity isn't just imagined here. It has been actively established and proven over time.
In the Sarah and John scenario, they're actively building a mutual narrative sequence together. When John suddenly vanishes without a trace, the cognitive loop stays jarringly, violently open.
Sarah's brain is thrown into chaos because an active mutual story was abruptly abandoned right in the middle of a chapter.
The established reciprocity was broken without any formal closure signal, leaving her scanning for answers that don't exist.
And then there's the third level, which frankly sounds devastating to experience, high-density relationships.
We are talking about long-term romantic partners of years, deep professional collaborations, or suddenly estranged family members.
This is where the experience of ghosting moves far beyond just narrative disruption or an open loop.
It becomes full-blown identity destabilization. Starr uses the term ontological dislocation to describe this level.
Ontological dislocation.
In high-density relationships, the other person actually scaffolds your very concept of self. You define a massive part of who you are, how you spend your time, and how you view the world through your relation to them.
They act as an external hard drive for your shared memories.
Yes.
It's like you've been leaning your entire body weight against a solid structural wall for years. You don't even think about the wall supporting you anymore. It's just a fact of your environment.
An ontological dislocation is when that wall vanishes into thin air without a sound.
You don't just lose the wall, you fall flat on your face. You lose your balance, your orientation, and your structural reality fractures.
That analogy perfectly captures the severity of the dislocation. It takes a tremendous amount of time and cognitive restructuring to stand back up after that kind of foundational loss.
So what does this all mean for the listener?
That's the big question.
We understand why the brain spins out trying to predict the future. We know why the ghoster uses silence to regulate their own discomfort. And we know the mechanics of why we inevitably blame ourselves.
Right.
But how do you actually apply this framework to stop the pain? How do you halt the endless mental looping?
Starr offers a very grounded, realistic warning here before introducing his solution. Simply understanding the mechanism of a biological process doesn't magically turn off the brain's predictive loop.
As we established, the human brain is evolutionarily designed to obsessively return to unfinished sequences.
Having intellectual clarity about why you are hurting does not come with a magical off switch for the pain.
You can't just logic your way out of ancient biological wiring in a single afternoon.
Exactly. However, what this understanding does provide is a powerful tool for cognitive reclassification.
Reclassification.
When your mind inevitably loops back to the last coherent moment you shared with the person who ghosted you, you don't have to spiral into a self-indictment.
You can meet that intrusive thought with an accurate structural interpretation.
To operationalize this, Starr lays out a highly disciplined three-step differentiation process. Step 1 is to recognize the cognitive trap.
But I imagine this is physically incredibly difficult to do in the moment, right? Because when you are ghosted, your nervous system is heavily dysregulated.
Very much so.
Your amygdala is firing, putting your body in a state of alarm.
It requires immense practice to overcome that nervous system response.
Yeah.
When you find yourself ruminating, sitting on the couch, obsessively checking their social media, you have to actively intervene in your own thought process.
You have to tell yourself out loud, if necessary, my system is currently trying to complete a story without collaborative data.
You must catch the brain in the act of predictive scanning and label the behavior for exactly what it is.
It's pulling yourself out of the content of the panic and observing the structure of it, like saying, there goes my brain, looking for the terminal punctuation again. It's just doing its job, but there's no data here.
That self-awareness is the crucial first step. Once you label it, you move to step 2. Externalize the silence.
You have to consciously and repeatedly reclassify their silence. It is not a verdict on your identity.
Their silence is simply data about their threshold.
This might be the most important realization of the entire deep dive.
I agree.
Their silence is just raw data regarding their complete inability to handle the emotional strain of an honest, sustained conversation.
It highlights their regulatory limits, their fear of confrontation, their lack of capacity.
It is a reflection of their psychological architecture, not a highlight reel of your failures.
Seeing the silence as their limitation leads seamlessly into step 3, interrupt global extrapolation.
As we discussed with proportional causality, the brain wants to take this rejection and make it mean that you are fundamentally flawed.
You have to aggressively interrupt that leap. You must remind yourself that this relationship ended within the very specific limits of that one person's tolerance and preferences.
You draw a fence around the event.
Yeah.
You confine it. It was a specific relational mismatch at a specific point in time. It cannot and does not generalize into a global deficiency about who you are as a human being.
The silence wasn't a comprehensive verdict on your worth. It just signaled a threshold in the other person's ability to remain engaged in the complexity of knowing you.
By correctly classifying their exit, you take back the narrative.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes painfully clear why mastering this reclassification process is so necessary right now. Ghosting is not a passing trend.
It's not going away.
No. We live in a modern, hyper-connected environment, heavily shaped by speed, digital disposability, and a shockingly low cultural tolerance for interpersonal confrontation.
Our communication tools are practically built to facilitate it. It's just too easy to push a block button, swipe away a notification, and make a complex human being disappear from your screen entirely.
It is brutally efficient, and as we discussed, it is minimally exposing for the person doing the ghosting.
Because of this environment, the absence you experience and the severe destabilization you feel are very real and entirely valid.
But the tendency to extract a permanent verdict on your fundamental human value from that absence that is structurally unnecessary.
And it is something you have the power to stop doing.
Absolutely.
That is the ultimate takeaway for you listening today. Yes, silence is efficient. But silence is not omniscient. It doesn't know everything about you.
It doesn't reveal your hidden flaws, and it certainly does not define you.
It only defines a strict limit in the emotional capacity of the person who chose to leave.
This does raise a profoundly important question, though, as we look to the future of human relationships.
Oh.
If human cognition is structurally dependent on clear closure signals to maintain our sense of narrative continuity, and if those signals are required for us to establish trust,
Right.
how might the increasing everyday normalization of ghosting be quietly rewiring our collective baseline for that trust? Are we slowly adapting as a species to view all new connections as inherently open-ended, unreliable, and unpredictable?
That's chilling.
If we constantly expect to turn the page and find nothing but blank paper, how does that defensive expectation fundamentally change the way we write the story of a new relationship from Chapter 1?
That is an incredibly powerful and frankly sobering thought to leave on.
Right.
A true paradigm shift to consider the next time you are navigating the early stages of a new connection. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. If this framework resonated with you today, we highly encourage you to look further into R.J. Starr's work to continue exploring these concepts. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, do not let someone else's silence write your story.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.